My name is Thomas Standing Bear, but for the first 16 years of my life, I was known simply as that Indian kid to most people in Millbrook, Montana. This is the story of how a town that treated me as less than human discovered that I held the power to change all their lives forever, and how ignorance and prejudice can blind people to the truth standing right in front of them. Millbrook was the kind of small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, where families had lived for generations, and where outsiders were viewed with suspicion. With a population of barely 3,000 people, nestled in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains, it was a place where change came slowly and old attitudes died hard. I lived on the outskirts of town with my grandmother, Mary Standing Bear, in a small house that had seen better days. The paint was peeling, the roof leaked during heavy rains, and the front porch sagged under the weight of too many Montana winters. But it was home, and my grandmother filled it with love, even when the rest of the world seemed determined to remind us that we didn't belong. My grandmother was a full-blooded member of the Blackfoot Nation, though she rarely spoke about our heritage. When I was younger and asked about our family history, she would get a distant look in her eyes and say, "Some stories are meant to be told when the time is right, Thomas, and that time hasn't come yet." I didn't understand then why she was so secretive about our past. I just knew that we were different from everyone else in Millbrook, and that difference made us targets. The discrimination started early. In elementary school, other children would make fun of my long black hair, calling me Pocahontas or making war whoops when I walked by. Their parents would look at me with barely concealed disdain when they picked up their children, whispering among themselves about those people living on the edge of town. By middle school, the taunts had evolved into something more sophisticated, but equally cruel. Teachers would overlook me when I raised my hand in class, assuming I wouldn't have anything worthwhile to contribute. When I excelled academically, which I did, thanks to my grandmother's insistence on education, they attributed it to affirmative action or special help, rather than my own intelligence and hard work. The worst part wasn't the overt racism, though that was bad enough. It was the way people looked through me, as if I was invisible, as if I didn't matter. Shop owners would follow me around their stores, assuming I was there to steal. Restaurant workers would seat me at the worst tables, and take forever to take my order. Even other teenagers my age would walk past me on the street as if I was part of the landscape. But it was in high school that the discrimination reached its peak, particularly from one family that seemed to take personal pleasure in making my life miserable. The Richardsons. James Richardson owned the largest ranch in the county and was considered one of the most powerful men in Millbrook. His wife Patricia served on the school board and ran most of the town's social events. Their son Brad was my age and the star quarterback of the high school football team. Together, they represented everything that Millbrook aspired to be: wealthy, established, and proudly white. The Richardsons made no secret of their feelings about Native Americans in general, and my family in particular. James Richardson had been vocal in town meetings about his opposition to any government assistance for tribal communities, calling it handouts for people who refused to integrate into American society. Patricia Richardson had tried multiple times to have my grandmother's property rezoned so it could be sold to developers, claiming our house was an eyesore that hurt property values. But it was Brad Richardson who made my daily life at Millbrook High School a living hell. "Hey, Chief," he would call out whenever he saw me in the hallways, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Shouldn't you be on a reservation somewhere?" His friends would laugh, and teachers would pretend they didn't hear. When I tried to join the debate team, something I was genuinely passionate about, Brad convinced his mother to have me removed, claiming I would bring down the intellectual level of the team. The breaking point came during my junior year, at the annual Millbrook Harvest Festival. It was the town's biggest event, held every October in the main square, with food vendors, live music, and various competitions. My grandmother had encouraged me to enter the essay contest about local history, a topic I had been researching extensively. I had spent months working on my essay, diving deep into the real history of the area, including the often overlooked contributions of Native American communities to the region's development. I documented how Native tribes had helped early settlers survive harsh winters, had served as guides and interpreters, and had shared agricultural knowledge that made farming possible in the difficult mountain climate. When the time came for the contest presentations, I stood nervously in front of a crowd of several hundred townspeople. I began reading my essay, detailing the complex and often tragic history of Native-white relations in the area, including the forced relocations and broken treaties that had shaped the region. I was only halfway through when James Richardson stood up from the audience. "This is ridiculous," he announced loudly. "Why are we listening to revisionist propaganda from someone who doesn't even belong here?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some people nodded in agreement, while others looked uncomfortable but said nothing. "Mr. Richardson," said the contest organizer, clearly flustered, "please let the boy finish his presentation." The boy Richardson laughed harshly. "This isn't a boy. This is an ungrateful outsider trying to rewrite our history to make his people look like victims." "James, please," my grandmother said, standing up from where she had been sitting near the back of the crowd. It was the first time I had ever heard her speak up in a public setting. "Oh, and here's the grandmother," Richardson continued. "Tell me, Mary, are you proud of raising a grandson who spreads lies about the good people of this town?" The crowd was completely silent now, all eyes moving between Richardson and my grandmother. I felt my face burning with humiliation and anger. But I also saw something I had never seen before in my grandmother's eyes. Not sadness or resignation, but a quiet, steely determination. "Mr. Richardson," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the square, "my grandson is telling the truth about history. Perhaps the question is why that truth makes you so uncomfortable." "Truth," Richardson scoffed. "The truth is that your people were conquered because they were primitive and couldn't adapt to civilization. The truth is that everything good about this land came from white settlers who had the vision and work ethic to build something meaningful." That was when my grandmother did something that shocked everyone, including me. She laughed, a genuine, amused laugh that seemed completely out of place in the tense confrontation. "Mr. Richardson," she said, still smiling, "you have no idea what you're talking about, but don't worry. Someday soon, you'll understand exactly how wrong you are." Richardson looked confused by her response, as if he had been expecting anger or defensiveness rather than confidence. "Is that some kind of threat?" he demanded. "No," my grandmother replied calmly. "It's a promise." The contest judges, uncomfortable with the confrontation, declared the event over without announcing winners. People began to disperse, most avoiding eye contact with my grandmother and me as they left. That night, as we drove home in my grandmother's old pickup truck, I finally asked the question that had been building inside me for years. "Grandmother, why do we stay here? Why do we put up with their hatred? We could move somewhere else, somewhere we'd be accepted." My grandmother was quiet for a long time, her weathered hands gripping the steering wheel as we drove through the Montana darkness. "Thomas," she said finally, "there are things about our family that you don't know yet, things that will change everything about how this town sees us. But you're not ready to hear those things." "When will I be ready?" "Soon," she said. "Very soon. But first, you need to understand something important. Never let other people's ignorance define your worth. You are more than they can imagine, and someday they will all know it." I didn't understand what she meant at the time. I just knew that I was tired of being invisible, tired of being treated like I didn't matter, tired of watching my grandmother endure discrimination with a patience I couldn't comprehend. What I didn't know was that my grandmother had been keeping a secret for 16 years, a secret that would not only change how the town saw us, but would give us the power to change the town itself. The next morning, my grandmother made a phone call that would set in motion events that would shake Millbrook to its foundation. I heard her speaking quietly in the kitchen, using words and phrases I didn't recognize, speaking in a language that sounded familiar but that I couldn't quite place. When she hung up, she looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, not sad or resigned, but purposeful and determined. "Thomas," she said, "it's time you learned who you really are." The revelation began with a simple question that my grandmother asked me on a cold November morning, 3 weeks after the humiliation at the Harvest Festival. "Thomas," she said as we sat at our small kitchen table, sharing breakfast and watching the first snow of the season fall outside our window, "what do you know about your parents?" I looked up from my oatmeal, surprised by the question. In 16 years, my grandmother had rarely mentioned my parents, beyond telling me that they had died when I was very young, and that she had raised me ever since. "Not much," I admitted. "You always said they died in a car accident when I was a baby, and that you didn't like talking about it because it was too painful." My grandmother nodded slowly, her weathered fingers wrapped around her coffee mug. "That's what I told you." "Yes, but Thomas, it's time you knew the truth." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold morning air seeping through our old windows. "What truth?" "Your parents didn't die in a car accident," she said quietly. "They're very much alive, and they've been looking for you for 16 years. The words hit me like a physical blow. I set down my spoon with shaking hands, unable to process what I was hearing. "That's impossible," I whispered. "You're my grandmother. You raised me. My parents are dead." "I am your grandmother," she confirmed, "but I'm not your father's mother. I'm your mother's mother, and your parents aren't dead. They were told that." "You were? I don't understand." My grandmother stood up and walked to an old wooden chest that sat in the corner of our living room. I had seen it countless times but had never been allowed to look inside. She opened it now and pulled out a manila folder thick with documents and photographs. 16 years ago, she began, sitting back down and opening the folder. "Your mother was a teenager, barely 18 years old. She was brilliant, beautiful, and about to start her freshman year at Harvard University on a full scholarship." She pulled out a photograph and placed it in front of me. It showed a young Native American woman with long black hair and intelligent eyes, standing in front of what looked like a university building. "This is your mother, Sarah Crowfeather." She was the daughter of Joseph Crowfeather, who was still as the chairman of the Blackfoot Nation. "Your grandfather is one of the most respected tribal leaders in North America." I stared at the photograph, seeing my own features reflected in the young woman's face. The resemblance was unmistakable. But if she's my mother, and she's alive, then why? Because, my grandmother interrupted gently. When your mother became pregnant with you during her summer break before college, certain people in this town decided that a teenage Native American mother would be an embarrassment to the community, especially when the father was a prominent white family's son. My blood ran cold. The father was white. Yes, and when his family found out about the pregnancy, they used their money and influence to ensure that the situation was, handled. Quietly. What do you mean, handled? My grandmother's expression grew dark. I mean that when you were born, you were taken from your mother while she was still recovering from childbirth. She was told that you had died due to complications. You were placed with me, and I was told to keep you hidden until the family could decide what to do with you permanently, who I demanded, though I was beginning to suspect I already knew the answer. Which family? The Richardsons. The name hit me like a sledgehammer. James Richardson, who had humiliated me at the harvest festival. Patricia Richardson, who had tried to force my grandmother off her land. Brad Richardson, who tormented me daily at school. Brad Richardson is my father, I asked, my voice barely a whisper. No, my grandmother said. Brad's older brother Michael is your father. He was 20 years old when you were born, and he was already engaged to the daughter of another wealthy ranching family. When your mother became pregnant, the Richardsons convinced him that his future would be ruined if anyone found out about the relationship. I felt sick to my stomach, so they just took me away. They paid off hospital officials, forged documents, and created an entire fictional narrative about your mother losing her baby. She spent months in deep depression, believing you were dead. Eventually, she dropped out of Harvard and moved away, unable to bear being in the area where she thought she had lost you. And you went along with this? I asked, anger beginning to rise in my voice. Thomas, my grandmother said, reaching across the table to take my hand. I was threatened with legal action if I didn't cooperate. I was told that if I tried to contact your mother or reveal the truth, you would be taken from me and placed in the foster care system, possibly even adopted by a family in another state. At least this way, I could keep you close and make sure you were safe. Safe. You call what we've endured for 16 years safe. You call being treated like dirt by the very people who stole me from my real family safe. I call keeping you alive safe, my grandmother said firmly. Because Thomas, there's something else you need to know. The Richardsons didn't just want to hide your existence from the community. They wanted to make sure you never learned who you really were, because they knew that someday you might have the power to destroy them. What power? My grandmother pulled out another set of documents from the folder. Your maternal grandfather, Joseph Crowfeather, isn't just the chairman of the Blackfoot Nation. He's also the CEO of Crowfeather Industries, one of the largest energy companies in the northwestern United States. The company owns mineral rights to thousands of acres of land, including significant oil and natural gas reserves. I stared at the documents, trying to process the implications. When your grandfather dies, my grandmother continued, his wealth and holdings will pass to his descendants. Your mother is his only child, which means she will inherit everything. And as her son, you will eventually inherit it as well. How much are we talking about? Conservative estimates put the total value at around $800 million. The number was so large that it seemed abstract, unreal. I had grown up in poverty, wearing secondhand clothes and eating government-subsidized lunches at school, while sitting on an inheritance worth nearly $1 billion. Does he know? My grandfather, does he know I exist? He suspected for years that something happened to you. He's never stopped looking, never stopped hiring private investigators to try to find his missing grandson. The phone call I made yesterday was to one of those investigators. You contacted them. It's time, Thomas. You're old enough now to understand the truth, and strong enough to handle what comes next. What comes next? My grandmother smiled for the first time in our conversation. What comes next is that Joseph Crowfeather is driving here from the reservation to meet his grandson. He'll arrive this afternoon. I spent the rest of the morning in a daze, trying to process everything my grandmother had told me. I skipped school, claiming I was sick, and spent hours looking through the documents and photographs she had shown me. There were pictures of my mother at various ages, documents outlining the Crowfeather family's business holdings, and most shocking of all, copies of the original legal documents that had facilitated my disappearance 16 years earlier. The papers showed a conspiracy that involved not just the Richardson family, but also several local officials, including the hospital administrator, a family court judge, and even the sheriff. Money had changed hands, documents had been falsified, and records had been sealed to ensure that my existence remained hidden. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a black Mercedes SUV pulled into our driveway. Through the window, I watched as a tall, dignified Native American man in an expensive suit stepped out of the vehicle. Even from a distance, I could see the family resemblance. The same dark eyes, the same strong jawline that I saw in the mirror every morning. My grandmother opened the door before he could knock, and the two of them embraced like old friends who had been separated for too long. Joseph, she said, tears streaming down her face. Thank you for coming. Mary, he replied, his voice deep and warm. Thank you for keeping him safe all these years." Then he looked at me, and I saw recognition in his eyes, despite the fact that we had never met. "Thomas," he said simply, and somehow, in that moment, I knew without a doubt that everything my grandmother had told me was true. We spent the next several hours talking. My grandfather, it felt strange to think of him that way, but that's what he was told me about my mother, about the family I had never known, about the heritage I had been denied. "Your mother never remarried," he said. "She never had other children. Losing you broke something inside her that never fully healed. She throws herself into charity work now, helping other Native American families who have been separated by the system. Does she know about me being alive? Not yet. I wanted to confirm it was really you before I told her. But Thomas, when she finds out, it will be the happiest day of her life." As we talked, I began to understand not just who I was, but what I represented. I wasn't just some poor native kid living on the outskirts of town. I was the heir to a business empire, the grandson of one of the most powerful Native American leaders in the country, but more than that, I was living proof of a crime that had been covered up for 16 years. A crime that implicated some of the most prominent families in Millbrook. "What happens now?" I asked my grandfather as the sun began to set. "Now," he said, "we decide how we want to handle this. We could pursue legal action against everyone involved. In your kidnapping, we could expose the corruption that allowed it to happen. Or we could simply take you home and let you rebuild your relationship with your family. What do you think I should do?" Joseph Crowfeather smiled, and I saw in his expression the same quiet determination I had seen in my grandmother's eyes at the harvest festival. "I think," he said, "that the people of this town owe you and your grandmother an apology, and I think they're about to learn that treating people badly can have consequences they never imagined." That night, as I lay in bed processing everything that had happened, I thought about all the years of discrimination, all the times I had been made to feel less than human, all the cruelty I had endured from people who had no idea that they were tormenting the heir to a fortune that dwarfed their own wealth. Tomorrow, I would still be Thomas Standing Bear, but I would also be the grandson of Joseph Crowfeather, heir to Crowfeather Industries, and living proof that the Richardson family and their co-conspirators had committed crimes that could destroy them all. The invisible boy was about to become impossible to ignore. Word traveled fast in a small town like Millbrook, even when you tried to keep things quiet. By Monday morning, news that Joseph Crowfeather, a name that even the most isolated Montana ranchers recognized, had been seen at my grandmother's house, had spread through the community like wildfire. I walked into Millbrook High School that morning knowing that this would be my last week as the invisible boy. My grandfather had arranged for me to transfer to a private boarding school in Denver for the remainder of the academic year, followed by enrollment in an elite prep program that would prepare me for college. But before I left, there were things that needed to be settled. The first sign that everything had changed came when I reached my locker. Students who had ignored me for years were now staring openly, whispering among themselves and pointing in my direction. Some looked curious, others appeared nervous, and a few seemed almost fearful. "Hey, Chief," came the familiar mocking voice of Brad Richardson from behind me. "I heard you had some visitors this weekend. Finally found your real family." I turned to face him, but for the first time in years, I didn't feel the familiar knot of anxiety in my stomach. Instead, I felt something I had never experienced before when confronting Brad Richardson. Pity. "Actually, yes," I said calmly. "I did find my real family. Did you know that you and I are related, Brad?" Brad laughed, but there was uncertainty in his eyes. "What are you talking about?" "Your brother Michael is my father." The laughter died on Brad's lips. Round us, the hallway had gone completely silent as other students stopped to listen. "That's impossible," Brad said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Is it? Ask your parents about what happened 16 years ago. Ask them about the baby they paid to have disappear. Ask them about the documents they forged and the officials they bribed." Brad's face had gone pale. "You're lying." "Am I then? Why does your mother keep trying to force my grandmother off her land? Why has your father spent years trying to make sure no one in this town takes us seriously? What are they so afraid of?" Before Brad could respond, the school's principal, Mr. Jenkins, appeared at my side. "Thomas," he said, his voice unusually respectful, "could I speak with you in my office, please?" As we walked toward the administrative offices, I noticed that Mr. Jenkins was treating me with a deference I had never experienced from him before. When we reached his office, I was surprised to find several other people waiting. The school superintendent, the chairman of the school board, and most surprisingly, Patricia Richardson. "Thomas," Mr. Jenkins began nervously, "we wanted to discuss your situation." "My situation?" Patricia Richardson stepped forward, her usual arrogance replaced by barely concealed anxiety. "Thomas, there seems to be some confusion about your family background. I'm sure we can clear this up quickly." "There's no confusion, Mrs. Richardson. Your family kidnapped me when I was a baby and spent 16 years making sure I never learned who I really was." "That's a very serious accusation," said the superintendent. "Do you have any proof?" I smiled and pulled out my phone. Would you like me to call my grandfather and have him explain it to you? I'm sure Joseph Crowfeather would be happy to discuss the legal action he's considering. The mention of my grandfather's name had an immediate effect. The school officials exchanged nervous glances, while Patricia Richardson looked like she might be sick. Perhaps, said the school board chairman, we should discuss how we can make this transition easier for Thomas. I'm sure there are scholarships or special programs we could arrange. You mean the kind of programs you denied me for the past 4 years? I asked. The kind of opportunities you said I wasn't qualified for. Thomas, Patricia Richardson said, trying to regain control of the conversation. I think there's been a misunderstanding. Your family has always been welcome in this community. Really? Is that why your husband publicly humiliated my grandmother at the Harvest Festival? Is that why your son has been tormenting me since elementary school? Is that why you've spent years trying to force us off our land? I think, said a new voice from the doorway, that Mrs. Richardson and I need to have a private conversation. Everyone turned to see Joseph Crowfeather standing in the doorway, wearing an impeccably tailored suit and radiating the kind of quiet authority that comes with real power. Mr. Crowfeather, stammered the superintendent, we weren't expecting you. I'm sure you weren't, my grandfather replied. But I thought it was important to personally thank the administration for the excellent care they've taken of my grandson over the years. The sarcasm in his voice was unmistakable. Thomas, he continued, would you mind waiting outside while I speak with these people? I nodded and left the office, but I could hear raised voices through the door for the next 20 minutes. When the door finally opened, Patricia Richardson emerged, looking ashen, followed by school officials who appeared to be in various states of shock. My grandfather emerged last, looking completely calm and unruffled. Come along, Thomas, he said. We have other appointments to keep. Our next stop was the sheriff's office, where my grandfather requested a meeting with Sheriff Donald Watson, the same Sheriff Watson who, according to the documents my grandmother had shown me, had been paid to help cover up my disappearance. 16 years earlier, Sheriff Watson was a large, intimidating man who had ruled Millbrook's law enforcement with an iron fist for over 20 years. He was also, as it turned out, completely unprepared to deal with Joseph Crowfeather. Mr. Crowfeather, the sheriff said as we entered his office, I understand you have some concerns about a historical matter. Historical, my grandfather replied. Sheriff Watson, kidnapping is a federal crime with no statute of limitations. I wouldn't call that historical. Now, let's not get ahead of ourselves, Sheriff Watson said, but I could see sweat forming on his forehead. If there was some kind of irregularity in the past, I'm sure we can work something out. The kind of irregularity where you took money to falsify police reports and ignore evidence of a crime? Sheriff Watson's face went red. I don't know what you think you know, but I know everything, my grandfather interrupted, placing a thick folder on the sheriff's desk. I have copies of every document, every payment, every forged signature. I have witness statements from hospital workers who were threatened into silence. I have bank records showing payments from the Richardson family to you and several other officials. Sheriff Watson opened the folder with shaking hands and paged through the documents. With each page, his face grew paler. What do you want? He asked finally. Justice, my grandfather replied simply. But I'm willing to settle for a full confession and your resignation. And if I refuse, then you'll be explaining your actions to federal investigators. The FBI takes crimes against Native American children very seriously, Sheriff Watson, especially when those crimes involve conspiracy, kidnapping, and civil rights violations. By that afternoon, news of Sheriff Watson's sudden resignation had spread throughout Millbrook. By evening, word had gotten out that he had been arrested by federal agents on charges related to corruption and civil rights violations. The final confrontation came that evening, when James Richardson arrived at our house uninvited, accompanied by his son Michael. My biological father, Michael Richardson, was 36 years old, successful-looking, and clearly uncomfortable. He stood behind his father like a guilty child, unable to meet my eyes. Mary, James Richardson said to my grandmother, we need to settle this matter privately, before it gets out of hand. The matter is already settled, my grandmother replied. Thomas knows who he is, and his real family has reclaimed him. Look, Richardson said, mistakes were made 16 years ago, but we can fix this. We can arrange for compensation, education, funding, whatever the boy needs. The boy, said my grandfather, emerging from the kitchen, doesn't need anything from you. Richardson spun around, clearly not having expected to find Joseph Crowfeather in our house. This is a family matter, Richardson said. It doesn't concern you, doesn't concern me. My grandfather's voice was dangerously quiet. Mr. Richardson, you stole my grandson and spent 16 years ensuring he was treated like garbage in your community. How exactly does that not concern me? Michael, my grandfather continued, turning to my biological father, do you have anything to say to your son? Michael Richardson finally looked at me, and I saw guilt and shame in his eyes. I was young, he said quietly. I was scared. I let my parents convince me that it was the right thing to do. The right thing? I asked. Letting me believe I was an orphan, watching me get tormented by your younger brother, allowing your family to treat my grandmother like she was worthless. I'm sorry, Michael said, tears forming in his eyes. I'm so sorry, Thomas. I've regretted it every day for 16 years. Your regret, my grandfather said, doesn't undo the damage you've caused. It doesn't give Thomas back his childhood, or his mother back the 16 years she spent grieving for a son she thought was dead. James Richardson, sensing that the conversation was not going in his favor, tried a different approach. What do you want from us? Money. We can arrange a trust fund, college payments, whatever you need. What I want, I said, speaking for myself for the first time in the conversation, is for you to understand what you've done. Not just to me, but to my mother, my grandmother, my entire family. I want you to know that your son has been living with the consequences of your decisions every day for 16 years. Every time he saw me at school, every time he heard Brad making fun of me, he knew he was looking at his own child being mistreated. I turned to Michael. And I want you to know that it's too late for apologies. You had a choice to make 16 years ago, and you chose your family's reputation over your own son. You made that choice again every day for 16 years when you could have told the truth but didn't. What about us? I asked, gesturing to myself and my grandmother. We're family too. We were always family, but you decided we didn't matter. Thomas, Michael said desperately, it doesn't have to be too late. We could, we could try to build a relationship now. I looked at him for a long moment. This man who was my biological father but who had never been anything resembling a parent to me? No, I said finally. We couldn't. You gave up that right when you decided to let me grow up believing I was nobody special. 3 weeks later, I left Millbrook for my new school in Denver. Federal investigations into the conspiracy that had hidden my identity were ongoing, with several more officials expected to face charges. The Richardson family was facing multiple lawsuits and had already lost several major business contracts as news of their actions spread. But more importantly, I was going home for Christmas. My mother, my real mother, was flying in from Seattle, where she now worked as a counselor for Native American families in crisis. For the first time in 16 years, she would get to hold her son as my grandfather and I drove away from Millbrook that final morning. I looked back at the town that had treated me as invisible for so long. Do you regret anything about how we handled this? My grandfather asked. I thought about it for a moment. No, they needed to understand that actions have consequences. They needed to learn that treating people badly can come back to haunt you. And what did you learn? I learned that I was never nobody, I said. I just didn't know who I was yet. The native boy who had been treated as a nobody was going home to claim his true identity. And in a small town in Montana, people would remember, for generations, the lesson about the danger of judging others based on ignorance and prejudice. Sometimes the person you're looking down on is looking back up at you from a position of power you never imagined. And sometimes, the invisible boy turns out to be the most important person in the room. The end.